The first signs were not the flames themselves, but the stillness. A lion lay close to the edge of the grassland, his tawny frame barely rising with each breath. The wind carried the smell of smoke, sharp and dry, and the crackling of fire rolled low across the plain. Beyond him, patches of grass bent under the weight of heat, blackened at the edges where the blaze crept closer. The rangers, moving quietly along the ridge, had come to track the fire's line. It was routine work in a dry season. Observe the spread, look for trapped animals, guide what could be guided, but their steps slowed when they saw him. The lion stretched unnaturally against the brittle grass. His flank quivered faintly, muscles trembling as if the effort of holding life had become too heavy. The air was thick and unsettled. Birds wheeled overhead, crying sharply as they fled the drifting smoke. Insects buzzed in brief bursts before falling quiet, silenced by the haze. The land seemed caught between panic and silence. The lion lifted his head once, sluggishly, and lowered it again with a soundless motion. His ears twitched weakly, not in the quick, alert way of a hunter, but in the slow, delayed response of exhaustion. Even from a distance, the rangers could see how thin his sides appeared. Drought and heat had already carved hardship into his frame. Now, with fire pushing closer, his strength had been pressed past its edge. One ranger whispered, barely above the hum of the grass, "He's not moving." Their eyes searched the ground around him, wary of hidden movement. No pride lingered close. No companion shadow crossed the grass. He was alone, his golden coat dulled by dust and streaks of soot. The wind shifted, lifting the mane along his neck and carrying sparks closer to his resting place. Each ember fell with a hiss, smothered quickly, but the line of fire was widening. The men stayed low as they edged forward, careful not to startle him. A lion's power, even weakened, could turn sudden, but the closer they drew, the clearer his condition became. His eyes blinked slowly, lids heavy, and when he exhaled, the breath rasped with dryness. The smoke deepened in the valley, rolling low as the fire gathered strength in patches of tall grass. Orange tongues flared in sudden bursts, then sank back into smoldering stalks. The crackle carried a strange rhythm, as though the earth itself were breathing under strain. The lion tried to shift. His forelegs pressed into the earth, claws scraping lightly against dirt, but his weight did not follow. After a pause, he released the effort, head lowering again, mane darkened with ash. The rangers stood still, measuring the space between survival and collapse. Each moment they delayed, the fire crept forward. Each moment they rushed, they risked startling him into wasting what little strength he held. The air grew hotter, pressing against skin and filling lungs with sharp dryness. Sweat clung to the men's brows as they scanned the landscape, gauging the angles of smoke and wind. The lion, framed against the trembling horizon, seemed both ancient and fragile. His tail flicked once, weakly, then lay still. One ranger crouched lower, voice soft, a murmur carried more by tone than by words. "Easy. Stay with us." The lion's ear turned faintly toward the sound. It was a small gesture, almost lost in the weight of the moment, but it revealed that he heard. He was still present, still tethered by the thinnest thread of awareness. Behind them, the sun glared pale and harsh, its heat mingling with the fire's rising breath. The grassland shimmered, edges of the horizon bending in waves. In that wavering air, the lion lay as if suspended between endurance and surrender. The fire line whispered closer, alive with sparks that leapt and vanished. Every sound urged haste, yet the rangers knew their next movements would decide whether he lived through the hour. And so, in that fragile stillness, they paused, watching the lion breathe, listening to the fire's murmur, waiting for the moment to act. The lion's chest rose in uneven rhythm, shallow and unsteady, as though each breath was a negotiation with the air around him. The smoke had thickened, rolling low across the plain, settling like a gray veil over the grass. Every exhale rasped dry against his throat. and with each inhale his ribs pushed sharply outward, revealing how little strength remained. The fire's crackle carried nearer, its heat brushing against the edges of his mane, and yet he made no move to flee. The rangers edged closer, their boots pressing softly into the brittle ground. They moved slowly, not out of fear, but respect. Even weakened, a lion held power. But here was no roar, no show of defiance, only the labor of survival, heavy and uncertain. His tail flicked once, half-hearted, before going limp again. His ears folded back, not in aggression, but in a quiet, instinctive withdrawal from the sting of smoke. One ranger bent low, squinting through the shifting haze to watch the lion's flanks. The movements were shallow, almost imperceptible, as though breath came in fragments. "He's fading," the man whispered, his voice barely rising above the crackle of fire. The words were not for anyone to answer, only to mark the truth laid bare before them. The lion lifted his head for a moment, blinking against the grit carried in the wind. His eyes, usually sharp and golden, appeared dull, rimmed with ash and fatigue. They swept the space around him without focus, as though searching for something that wasn't there: shade, water, safety, and finding only fire and open grass. His jaw parted slightly, and the breath that passed through it was shallow, a thin rasp that disappeared into the heavy silence. The rangers paused a few paces away, their bodies still, waiting. To rush forward would be to startle him, perhaps force him into a final, desperate burst of movement that the fire would soon consume. To wait too long was to leave him to the smoke. The balance of timing hung fragile in the air, measured by the sound of each faint breath. A gust of wind swept across the plain, bending the tall grass in a single direction, carrying sparks closer. The lion shifted with effort, pressing his front legs beneath him, claws digging faintly into the soil. His muscles trembled violently, unable to lift his weight. He sagged back down with a heavy thud, his sides heaving from the attempt. The men watched in silence, their faces drawn, their eyes narrowing against the smoke. They had seen animals caught in droughts, wounded in fights, or lost in exhaustion. But there was something striking in this lion's stillness, a creature built for power, now grounded by breath alone. The fire line flared suddenly, a brief roar of orange that sent sparks spiraling into the sky. The lion turned his head toward it, ears twitching faintly. His body made no effort to rise. His instincts surely knew the danger, but his strength answered with refusal. His breathing grew noisier, a rough rattle in his throat that scraped with every inhale. One ranger stepped forward, crouching low as he murmured, "Easy, boy. Just hold on." His voice was calm, steady, the kind of tone meant not to command but to reassure. The lion's ear shifted toward the sound again, and for a moment, his eyes steadied, focusing dimly on the figure before him. The minutes stretched. Each one carried the fire closer, the heat pressing heavier against the men's backs. Ash drifted down like dark snow, settling on skin, on the lion's mane, on the ground around them. Still the men waited, searching for the right moment to move without breaking the fragile tether that held the animal to awareness. The lion coughed once, a low, rasping sound that shook through his frame. His body curled slightly with the effort, then sagged again, spent. His tongue slipped past his lips, dry and cracked, a faint tremor running along its edge as he gasped shallowly. The rangers exchanged a glance. Time was unraveling quickly. Every sign told them the smoke was winning. The lion's breath no longer carried the strength of defiance. It was the quiet endurance of something slipping away. Another gust of wind carried the smell of burning grass stronger now, sharp and bitter in the lungs. The men felt it in their throats, their own breaths catching. For the lion, each inhale had become a burden nearly too heavy to bear. Still, in the midst of his struggle, there was a flicker of resilience. His paw shifted faintly, claws flexing weakly against the soil as though testing the ground. His head lifted once more, wobbling under its weight, but lifted nonetheless. His eyes opened wider, catching the faint glint of firelight, holding it for a moment before blinking heavily again. The Rangers held their ground, hearts steady but urgent. The time for watching was nearly gone. The fire would not wait, and neither would the breath of the lion. In that moment, standing within the rising haze, they knew. The next step would have to be theirs. The fire pressed closer, its heat rising in waves that bent the horizon, and the men knew the waiting had reached its limit. The lion's breath rattled in uneven bursts, and though his eyes remained half open, their focus wavered as if vision and strength were slipping together. He would not last here much longer. The Rangers exchanged a quiet nod, the kind that carried understanding without words. It was time to move him. They stepped carefully, circling to give him space while staying downwind of the flames. The fire hissed against dry stalks, sparks jumping ahead like scouts of the blaze, reminding them that hesitation would only tighten the noose of heat. The men moved slowly, their gestures measured, speaking in low tones that blended into the sound of wind. Nothing hurried, nothing sharp, only the steady rhythm of calm. One ranger reached into his pack, uncoiling a length of cloth he had carried for emergencies. He dragged it lightly across the grass to brush aside embers before placing it over his own shoulders. The lion's head turned slightly at the motion, eyes flickering with awareness. His ears pressed back, then lifted again, uncertain but alert. His foreleg tensed, claws scratching faint lines into the soil as instinct tested the threat. The ranger crouched, voice steady. "Easy now. You're safe." The tone was softer than the smoke that wrapped around them, carrying more weight in its gentleness than the fire carried in its roar. The lion's breathing hitched, body trembling from effort as he shifted to one side. His mane dragged through ash, scattering gray dust into the air. For a moment it seemed he might rise, his muscles drawing taut with intent, but again his strength failed. He sagged into the grass, chest heaving from the strain. The men moved in closer, hearts careful, each step deliberate. They used their bodies to guide, not to touch, forming a quiet barrier between the lion and the creeping flames. Slowly they leaned their weight into the air itself, shaping the path of least resistance, urging him forward without force. The fire crackled behind, the heat a pressing hand. Ahead, the open stretch of safer ground waited, wide and darkened but free of sparks. The lion blinked heavily, eyes dragging toward the space before him. He groaned low in his throat, a sound raw with fatigue. Then, with a shudder, he pressed one paw forward. The motion was clumsy, his body swaying as if his bones carried the weight of stone. Another paw followed, dragging through the grass. It was not a stride, but a crawl of determination. The Rangers moved with him, stepping back in rhythm, offering space when he shifted, closing gently when he faltered. Their voices came in soft fragments, little more than hums. "That's it. Keep going." The words were less command, more presence, a quiet reassurance threading through the smoke. The lion's breaths grew harsher with each movement, the rasp of effort tearing through the heavy air. His sides heaved, ribs striking sharply against his hide. Still, he moved, each step a testament to the thin but unbroken will to live. His tail dragged limp across the ground, leaving faint lines in the ash, while his mane caught sparks of light, glowing briefly as the fire's reflection danced across it. After what felt like endless steps, his body faltered. His front legs gave way, collapsing into the dirt with a thud that shook the dust loose from his coat. His head sank heavily, muzzle pressing into the earth. His breath came fast and shallow, almost whimpering in its exhaustion. The Rangers froze, letting the stillness settle. They did not press him forward again. He had reached a line of safety, the scorched stretch where the fire had already passed and could not return. Here, the danger was behind, the air clearer though still heavy with smoke. They knelt a distance away, keeping their bodies low, letting silence carry between them. The lion lay motionless except for the frantic rise and fall of his chest. Then, slowly, his breathing began to even. Not strong, not full, but steadier than before. His eyes half closed, lids drooping with the surrender of one who had reached a fragile reprieve. The fire roared behind them, climbing higher into the grass they had left. The sky glowed faintly orange, streaks of ash curling upward in twisting spirals. Yet here, in the darkened earth, there was stillness, fragile, but real. One ranger exhaled, almost a sigh, and whispered into the smoke, "You made it." The lion's ear flicked faintly at the sound, a tiny acknowledgement carried through exhaustion. His body remained still, but for the first time since they had found him, the air around him no longer trembled with the threat of surrender. He had survived the fire's edge. The lion lay on the scorched earth, his breaths ragged but no longer breaking apart in desperation. The rangers remained a careful distance away, giving him space as the fire hissed further down the valley. For the first time, there was a fragile sense of safety. The air here was cooler, touched by ash but not by flame. The men thought they had brought him through the worst of it. Then came a sound none of them expected. It was not the crackle of burning grass, nor the hiss of smoke rolling across the plain. It was higher, thinner, a mewling cry, weak and trembling, carried on the shifting wind. One man turned his head sharply, unsure if his ears had caught it true. Then it came again, clearer this time, rising softly out of the grass behind the lion. The rangers froze, their eyes searching the smoke. For a moment, only silence answered. The lion's ears flicked faintly, his head lifting an inch from the earth as if the sound tugged at something buried in him. His gaze shifted toward the haze. Then, from the blackened grass, a small, trembling shape stumbled forward. A cub, its coat singed with ash, emerged with unsteady steps. Its legs wobbled beneath the weight of fear and exhaustion, its muzzle parting as it gave another faint cry. Behind it came a second, crawling low to the ground as though hiding from the heat still lingering in the earth. Both were tiny, fragile in their movements, and impossibly vulnerable against the fire that had swept their world. The ranger's breath caught, the enormity of the discovery sinking in. The lion was not simply a lone survivor of smoke and heat. He was a father, his strength spent not only on his own survival, but in holding ground for his young. The cubs pressed close to their father, brushing their small bodies against his mane. He turned his head weakly, nuzzling one with the barest motion, his muzzle trembling with the effort. The other climbed awkwardly across his leg, tucking itself into the curve of his body as if seeking shelter where no flame could reach. The sound of their faint whimpers carried through the haze, small voices breaking through the silence of ash. The rangers stood still, their presence softened further, as though even breathing too loud would disturb the fragile reunion. They had known fire could scatter herds, trap antelope, or push predators into flight, but they had not imagined the smoke would reveal something like this. A lion, weakened to the edge of collapse, shielding the last measure of his strength for two cubs hidden in the grass. One man whispered, almost reverently, "Cubs!" The word fell quickly into silence, swallowed by the wind. The lion shifted, his body straining as he adjusted to curl slightly toward them. His chest rose in shallow waves, yet within that weakness lay an unmistakable instinct. His tail flicked faintly, brushing one cub as it pressed against his side. His eyes, dull with fatigue, lingered on them longer than they had on anything else. The fire beyond roared louder as it reached another cluster of dry stalks. The sky glowed faintly red through the haze, a reminder that danger was still close. The cubs flinched at the sound, their small bodies trembling. One gave a thin, frightened cry, and the lion answered with a low groan, deep and unsteady, yet carrying a note of reassurance. The men watched with quiet awe. They had set out to save one life, and now three clung to the thin line between survival and loss. Each breath the lion took seemed heavier, Yet the cubs pressed tighter to him, finding safety not in strength, but in presence alone. The wind shifted, carrying cooler air from behind the fire line. The smoke thinned just enough to reveal the darkened stretch of safe ground where the rangers had guided the lion. And there, in the fragile stillness between fire and ash, the family held together, exhausted, trembling, yet alive. The rangers did not move closer. They simply stood in silence, letting the moment settle into them, each aware of how rare it was to witness something so raw and unguarded. The cubs, soot-streaked and frail, tucked themselves tighter against their father's mane. Their tiny breaths mingled with his labored ones, the sound soft and fragile yet filled with the persistence of life refusing to yield. And as the fire's light flickered behind them, the truth of the discovery sank deep. The lion had not been fighting for himself alone. He had been holding on for them. The cubs pressed tightly against their father, their small bodies shivering from fear and smoke. His strength was almost gone, yet he shifted with effort, lowering his great head until his muzzle brushed across their backs. The gesture was weak, barely more than a trembling touch, but it carried the weight of protection. The cubs quieted, their cries softening into tiny, rhythmic breaths, as though his presence alone could steady them. The rangers stood at a distance, their movement stilled by the fragile sight. No hand reached forward, no voice rose above a whisper. They had seen lions hunt, roar, and defend their prides with fierce power, but this was different. This was survival stripped down to its gentlest form. Here was a father, scarred by fire and exhaustion, offering the last measure of his strength to keep his young alive. The lion's mane was streaked with soot, edges curled from the heat. His chest rose and fell heavily, each breath scraping against the dryness of his throat. Yet his eyes, though dulled by fatigue, flicked between the cubs as if counting them again and again. His tail twitched faintly, brushing the ground in slow intervals, a silent reassurance to the little ones pressed so tightly against him. The cubs nuzzled into the rough fur of his neck, pawing softly at his chin. Their tiny claws snagged against his mane, and he did not flinch. Instead, he shifted once more, curling his body just enough to form a shallow shelter. His ribs ached with the movement, but he endured it, creating a shield of warmth and protection despite his own fragility. The rangers exhaled slowly, their eyes fixed on the fragile reunion. One man murmured, "Stay strong, old boy." The words nearly lost to the hum of ash carried on the wind. The lion's ear turned faintly at the sound, but his focus did not waver from the cubs. For long minutes, the family lay in silence, broken only by breathing, the deep, ragged sound of the father, and the softer, hurried rhythm of the cubs. Beyond them, the fire raged further down the valley, its crackle like distant thunder. Here, on the safe stretch of burned ground, it felt as though time itself had slowed, circling tightly around the bond between them. The cubs began to stir, their small voices mewling quietly as if seeking reassurance. One crawled across the lion's foreleg, its tail flicking nervously as it pressed its nose against his. He responded with a low groan, a sound deep in his chest, drawn from a place of tenderness rarely witnessed. The cub blinked, settling at his side once more. Ash drifted through the air like gray snow, landing lightly on their backs. The lion's mane caught the flakes, giving the impression of age beyond his years. Still, he did not shake them free. Every ounce of energy was poured into the act of staying present for his young. His body trembled with fatigue, yet his head remained low, resting against them as though refusing to let them out of reach. The rangers knew they could do nothing more now. This was no moment for interference. Their task had been to pull him from the edge of the fire, and now nature would decide the rest. They stood in reverent silence, watching resilience unfold not through power, but through quiet endurance. The cubs eventually quieted, their tiny bodies pressed together in a small pile of warmth at their father's chest. Their breaths grew steadier, their movements less frantic. The lion, though trembling, closed his eyes for a moment, his muzzle resting gently against their backs. It was not sleep, but something close. A pause, a surrender to the safety of this fragile moment. The men remained motionless, ash swirling around them, their hearts carrying the weight of what they witnessed. They knew the wild was often cruel, that fire and hunger could erase life without pause. Yet here, in this pocket of silence, the will to endure had written itself in the smallest of gestures. A father's weak nuzzle, the cub's quiet trust, the stubborn insistence of life against the backdrop of destruction. And as the wind shifted, carrying the sound of the fire further away, the stillness deepened, leaving only the steady rhythm of 3 breaths mingling together in the ash. The hours passed slowly, and the fire that had once roared with urgency began to soften into silence. Its flames shrank to scattered tongues of light, feeding only on what little dry grass remained. Smoke drifted upward in thinning streams, no longer dense enough to choke the air, but still heavy with the smell of what had been lost. The scorched ground lay dark and brittle, a plain of ash stretching out in irregular patches. The lion stirred in this quiet aftermath, his body heavy, yet refusing to remain down. His cubs pressed close to his side, their small faces streaked with soot, their ears twitching at every sound. He exhaled a long, strained breath, then pressed his forepaws into the ground. His muscles trembled under the effort, shaking with weakness, but he pushed again, lifting his chest from the earth. The rangers watched in silence. They had seen his collapse, his struggle to breathe, the near stillness that might have ended him. Now, to witness him rise was something beyond instinct alone. It was the slow return of endurance. They stood quietly, not daring to step closer, knowing the choice to move now belonged to him. The lion swayed as he gained his footing, his legs stiff, his body hunched as though the weight of exhaustion still chained him. The cubs whimpered softly, their calls high and uncertain. He turned his head toward them, muzzle brushing one before leaning down to nudge the other. The small cries faded at the touch. They pressed tighter against his legs, reassured by the contact. Step by step, the lion began to move. Each pace was unsteady, his claws dragging faintly across the charred soil. His mane caught the low light of the fading fire, strands of ash falling free with every motion. The cubs followed close, their little paws slipping in the dust, ears pricked toward every whisper in the grass. The father paused often, as though measuring his strength against the distance still to come, but he did not turn back. The rangers moved only to keep him in sight, their own steps light against the brittle ground. No words passed between them now. The scene carried its own voice, the faint patter of cubs pressing close, the scrape of claws through ash, the sigh of the wind across the burnt plain. The lion guided them toward the open expanse beyond the fire's reach. There, untouched grass rippled in long, gentle waves, pale gold under the evening sun. The smell of smoke lingered behind, but ahead the air was clear, cool with the approach of night. Each step carried him further from danger, closer to the living plains that would shelter his young. His breathing remained labored, but steadier than before. The cubs stumbled, sometimes lagging behind, but he paused for them, lowering his head until they caught up. The bond was wordless, carried only in these pauses, these small nudges, these moments of waiting. The men who had guided him from the fire understood their role was ending. They slowed, allowing distance to stretch between themselves and the lion. What had been an act of protection became now a quiet farewell, given without ceremony. Their presence was no longer needed, and so they faded back, leaving the family to the silence of the plains. The sun hung low, brushing the horizon with muted red. Its light spilled across the grass, gilding the ash with a faint shimmer, turning even the scars of fire into a canvas of evening glow. The lion's silhouette stood tall against it, no longer broken in the earth, but upright, leading his cubs forward. One cub stumbled again, its small body nearly folding under its own weight. The lion stopped, turned, and lowered his head until his muzzle brushed it upright. The cub blinked, then hurried to follow, pressing once more against the curve of his leg. Together they walked into the rippling grass. The rangers stood motionless, watching until the figures grew faint in the fading light. The cub's tiny shapes vanished first, swallowed by the tall stalks. Then the lion himself, his mane trailing like smoke until he, too, was gone. The plain grew quiet. Only the whisper of wind through the grass remained, carrying with it the faint smell of ash. The fire had passed, leaving behind ruin and renewal alike, and within that silence the memory of survival lingered, not in triumph, but in the quiet image of a father leading his young into the dawn of another day.